Good evening. My name is Thurman Greco, and this program is called Let's Live, and it comes to you from Woodstock, New York. And I am introducing to you this evening my memoir that I wrote about my time in the food pantry between about 2005 and 2013. I left the food pantry in September of 2013 and went to Boyceville and began assisting Bonnie Likes and Sean Bigler start their pantry, the Reservoir Food Pantry, out in Boyceville. And I began, the day that I actually began work on the designing and the processing of the paperwork and everything to get the pantry going from the Reservoir Food Pantry was the day that I actually began work on this book. I went down to Gotham in New York City and I began taking a memoir class. And so this book, the result, is a memoir. It's a memoir about hunger and miracles in America. And it actually is a history of Woodstock between those short years. And this particular time in Woodstock was very important. And the reason it was important was because the economy tanked. And we went through many, many changes in this community. And of course, communities all over our nation went through these changes. But there are very few actual accounts of what happened because there are very few books about hunger and food pantries in this country. The first book, there are only about 3 actually, was Take This Bread by Sarah Miles. Now, Sarah Miles was in the St. Gregory's of Nicaea Episcopal Church in San Francisco. And she wrote, before it was all over with, and it may not be over yet for her either, 3 books about working in a food pantry. But her story was more of a come to Jesus moment. And she talks about beginning her life and being an adult and being an atheist and finding the church and finding the food pantry. And the food pantry tracked her finding Jesus. It really was very good that way. The other one that is written about is called Under the Overpass, and that's by Mark Jankowski. And he also was a born-again Christian. But that story is more about homelessness than it is about food pantries. He actually lived as a homeless person for about 5 months and traveled throughout the country. And his result was 2 books, but the first one was called Under the Overpass. I wrote mine, and it's called I Don't Hang Out in Churches Anymore. And the reason it's called I Don't Hang Out in Churches Anymore, there are 2 reasons for this. One is that my editor wanted me to call it that. And I didn't have a better title, so I went for it. And it's very, very honest. I don't hang out in churches anymore because I hang out in the food pantries, which are in the basement of the churches. And it's a completely different place. And so that's the story about the I don't hang out in churches anymore. And it kind of frightens people. Some people are afraid to pick it up, which is fine. Because you want a title that's going to make people think. You want a title that's going to be thought-provoking. And I do have a sequel, as did Sarah Miles. I do have a sequel to this story that is in the editor's stage right now that is called The Unworthy Hungry. So that one has also a very thought-provoking title. This book is very, very interesting. It is a memoir. It starts off with my early life, and the parts of my early life that influenced how I acted in the food pantry are related. Because, as you go through life, you do have experiences that influence your future decisions and your future attitudes. And I can remember that I was asked to volunteer in the Good Neighbor Food Pantry in Woodstock, and I had no attitude about hunger at all. It was just not. It was not there. And of course, the reason that I had no attitude about hunger at all was that I had lived in 2 Latin American countries where hunger was prevalent. And I just didn't see that kind of prevalence in this country. So that if you wanted to talk about hunger in this country, my response was forget about it. There was no hunger. There is no hunger. And of course there is, but it's a different kind. But it was not in my first 2 experiences with hunger, it was not anything like it is in this country. Nobody ever came up to this country and tried to sell me an infant. Nobody ever came up to this country that was dying of hunger. I never saw any child on a street and realized that child was not 4 or 5 years old. That child was, in fact, probably 12 or 14 years old. But because he or she had not received enough food, the only way I could tell that child's age was through the teeth. So there are those kinds of experiences that I had that influenced the way I managed the pantry during the years of 2005 to 2013. And because I started out in this pantry, they were serving about 12 to 25 people a week. And the pantry was open for a couple of hours, and people would kind of stroll in. They'd get a can of tuna fish, they'd get a box of cereal, maybe get a jar of peanut butter. If things were good, maybe they'd find something else. But there really wasn't that much available in that pantry. And when not long after and food pantries did not raise money at all. If you wanted something and you couldn't get it from your local church or synagogue or whatever, you did without. So as soon as I became active in the food pantry, or very soon after, several months after I became active in the local food pantry, the economy truly tanked, and the state of New York being what it is, and every few weeks I tell people how much I love the state of New York, because they really do get control of things and they do really take care of things properly. It wasn't long until I was invited to Latham weekly almost to go to training classes. And the training classes were offered for a reason. All of a sudden, I was told, you're going to serve fresh produce in this pantry. Fresh produce? We're going to serve fresh produce? You are going to serve 1% milk. You're going to serve whole grain breads. You're going to serve a 3-day supply of food. And of course, I was new to the pantry, and I was barely realizing that we weren't serving a 3-day supply of food to everyone in the pantry. So I was very anxious to get with the program. And so I would go up to Latham and I would come back with all of this new information stuck between my ears and all this food in the back end of the car. And for years, I drove to Latham every Friday and picked up about 1,000 pounds of free USDA food. And of course, the United States Department of Agriculture, when we have extra food, when we have excess, they can and freeze and bottle and whatever, a lot of it. And I brought it back to the pantry, and other people were doing it as well. And I went up every Friday and came back with 1,000 pounds. I probably would have come back with more, but my car wouldn't really hold more than 1,000 pounds. So that's what I brought back. And while I was learning how to deal with a food pantry, people in this area were waking up to the fact that they had no money, that they had lost their job, that they had had their house foreclosed on, that their income was gone. And so they were beginning to come to the pantry. And we no longer were serving 24 people or 12 people a week, which we had been doing. This town, this community, had been serving since 1990 12 to 24 people a week, mostly senior, single, homeless men, and Woodstock's colorful characters, of which I noticed that there are fewer and fewer as I walk down the sidewalks in Woodstock. But there were all of these characters, and these 25, this core, increased to 100, 200, 300 people a week. And it was just all I could do to keep up with the food. And because the room was so teeny, and when the first time I walked into the food pantry, this teeny room had hardly any food in it at all. And the people just kind of wandered in, got their can of tuna fish, and left. And after a while, we had huge numbers of people. And they were hungry, and they needed the food. They needed the food for themselves. They needed the food for their households. They needed the food for their children. And we had people who were losing houses because of foreclosure. We had 2 major storms during that time. We had Hurricane Irene and we had Superstorm Sandy. And during that time, we had groups of people that came in. They came into the pantry because they had heard about it, and they had gone to bed the night before realizing that, rain was on the way, and they woke up in the morning and they had nothing. Their house was gone, their car was gone, their job was gone. They were essentially in really bad situation. And so we had these different things happening while I was in that pantry. So it makes for a very, very interesting story. But one of the things that makes for a very, very interesting story was that when I first walked into the food pantry at first day, I truly felt the presence of my grandmother. And it was very, very strong. There was no other way about it. She was there. She came straight into my head. And what she had me do was keep a dialogue journal. And I was never a writer. I never wanted to be a writer. I was never interested in being a writer. I didn't know anything about writing. I did other things with my life. As a matter of fact, I was a healer. I taught Reiki. I taught reflexology. I didn't write. But here I was in 2013 with all of these notes, and with my mother very, very forcefully, and my grandmother even more forcefully, telling me what I had to do. So, when you get this book, you will have in your hand a tribute to those in our country who don't have enough to eat, and to those who help the hungry get the food they need to survive. These stories took place mostly in a food pantry in the most famous little town in America. But don't be deceived. They are much bigger than the Good Neighbor Food Pantry, and they are certainly bigger than Woodstock, New York. Stories, prayers, and essays in this section focus on questions that shoppers had as we all journeyed down a path from hunger to the pantry and beyond. Why did this happen? What is the way forward now? These were the questions that everybody asked. How can I go on? people would come in, and 2 days ago, they never even thought about pantries for a good number of them. And all of a sudden, there they were standing in one. And it was like, well, what am I going to do now? Support offered in the hallway, the pantry room, and the barn helped us all understand that we were not singled out. Instead, we were in a situation that could happen to anyone, and there is room for everyone in the pantry. And I would like to share a short chapter that I call Welcome. She had a backpack, and he carried more of a knapsack. I saw them coming into the parking lot as they rode on bicycles. "Hi," I said in my most inviting tone. "Welcome to the pantry." They entered the pantry room, gently touched the food as if in a museum store. They picked up items and then put them back on the shelf when they wouldn't fit into the packs. It seemed we offered more than they could carry home. They finally agreed on what they could carry and headed off home, wherever or whatever that was. They came to the pantry to shop many times after this first time. I saw them riding their bicycles into the parking lot. This first visit was repeated over and over and over. They never were comfortable in the pantry room. Each visit was quiet voices and gentle touches as they finally agreed on what they could carry. They kept their story, themselves, and their lives separate and hidden away. I would have loved to know this couple better, but it was just not on their agenda. All I could do was continue to be a compassionate observer, hoping that one day they would be more comfortable with their situation and their trips to the pantry. That was my welcome to the pantry. And each chapter, each thing that I read, talks about the people that came to the pantry. And it talks about some of the things that happened during the time. And I have in the back, I have a glossary, which I have found since exposing this book to a lot of people, to many people. Many people are buying it. Many people have looked at it. I have found that it's a very controversial glossary, that it upsets people because the words that are in this glossary describe the vocabulary of the poor people of the pantry. And these people were the face of God. I offer my gratitude to everyone who shops at a pantry, works in a pantry, donates food, money, time, criticizes the pantry and/or myself. Your participation in this ongoing endeavor to feed the hungry shoppers supports and strengthens the entire process. And we have to realize, this is an important thing. Some people think that by feeding the hungry, we are fighting against hunger. And that is not the case. We have not even begun to fight against hunger. We have not even begun to even try to figure out how to conquer hunger. All we are doing when we feed people in this pantry is offering the people and the people in their household a 3-day supply of food and nothing more. We are keeping the people who come to our pantry from going hungry for 3 days. And I think it's important to realize that when people come to our pantry, a pantry, your pantry, my pantry, somebody, doesn't make any difference where they go, they get a 3-day supply of food. There are 7 days in the week. So they take that 3-day supply of food home and they make it last for 7 days. So you ask, how do you do that? How do you take what you have and make it last twice what it should? So that's a really, an interesting take on food pantries. So we have a glossary. I'm going to read a couple of things from the glossary. Volunteers working at a food pantry offer service opportunities for people of all ages. The more people donate time, the less isolated these facilities become. When volunteers divert food from landfills, they offer communities an opportunity to improve our environment. And make no mistake about it, the majority of the food that is served in a food pantry was on its way to the dump. That's pure and simple. That's as straight as I can put it. We, meaning food manufacturers, farmers, retailers, grocery stores, anybody that handles food, who gets it to a food bank, diverts that food from where they found it to the landfill. And when it's diverted, once it gets to the food bank, it ends up in a food pantry. And it's in this area, in the Hudson Valley, this food for the most part is organic. And it's not even labeled as organic. And the reason it's not labeled as organic is because if you're going to label it organic, you got to pay somebody to put the labels on each one of the cantaloupes or each one of the tomatoes or each one of the whatevers. And they're not going to pay anybody to do that. They're not even going to give you the organic labels that you can do it, because that costs money, and they are through putting money into this product. This product is going to go to a food pantry, and if the food pantry doesn't use it, it's going to the dump. End of subject. So we have to realize what we have, what we are feeding to the least among us. And many, many people. Sometimes I go, and it happened when I was, when I was in the food pantry, and like 2011, 2012, 2008, you would hear people, you would read things about people saying, well, everybody going to a food pantry is just a freeloader. I saw all these cars there. So-and-so's son got a job. People who work shouldn't be allowed to go to food pantries. Listen, there is a whole bunch of people in this country who can hold down 1, 2, and 3 jobs, and they still don't have enough money for food. And that's because the salaries that they get, the money that they get isn't enough. And when you're at the lowest level on the rung of the ladder, when you're the lowest rung on the ladder, the employer thinks nothing about not paying you at all, because you're voiceless. You have no way to fight back. And in the last few years, if you pay attention to the radio or you pay attention to the television, you read about, this wealthy person or that wealthy person that just didn't pay their bills. They just didn't pay the people who worked on the contract. Well, those are the people who finally sometimes end up in a food pantry because they're hungry. And, we experienced in this, there was a couple of 3 weeks here, and fortunately, it was only like 3 or 4 weeks. It wasn't long. We experienced, we had an experience. The people who came to the pantry, the people who worked at the pantry, and I never really talked about it very much, so it's possible that people who worked in the pantry didn't realize it. There were people coming through this pantry who owned a business in Woodstock, and they were bringing their employees with them. So what that told me was they weren't making enough money to pay their employees. I don't know that that's true. That was an assumption I made. But I know that after a few weeks, the owners quit coming. And I felt then that the economy had taken a little bit of a turnaround. But we're still having foreclosures. It's 2017, 2018. We're still having foreclosures in this area. And I can remember people standing in the hallway in the food pantry and talking with each other about, and they were embarrassed. After a while, they were embarrassed because, everybody around them. Once you bring up a subject, you realize right away that you're not alone. And foreclosures was something, oh my God, and I can remember we lived in our house here on Tannery Brook, and a woman came over to our house one day, and she said, well, I have a little bit of news for you. She said, I'm going to be going through foreclosure, and I'm going to lose my house, and I'm going to have to move. And I said, I'm so sorry. I wasn't surprised at all. Of course she was. She was having a terrible, terrible time in her life. And she was very ill, and her medical expenses were high. She had reached a point where, and nobody was buying the house. So that's how it went. So we go back to the glossary now, and we have an index in this book. So if you're looking up something, you can pretty well find it. And then we have this glossary. And then back in the back, if you are in a reading group, we have some discussion questions. And they focus on things that happened in this book that would be good suggestions for people to read from. And then in the back, in the very back, is an action guide. And this action guide is about 2 pages long. And it also comes as a, if you pick it up, it comes as a marker that you can put between the pages. And it talks about what you can do to fight hunger and homelessness. You can donate food to a food pantry. When you purchase groceries, buy a few extra jars or cans and take them over to your new neighborhood food pantry. I recommend peanut butter. Peanut butter is the essential basic. It's good. It doesn't need refrigeration. So if a person is either homeless or has no refrigerator, then you don't have to worry about that. It's good for all ages. Children like it. Working people like it. Seniors like peanut butter. It's also good for homeless people because you can carry it in a backpack. And it's also good for people who have no teeth. And it's an interesting thing about people who have no teeth. There are a lot of people who have no teeth in a food pantry. The next thing you can do is you can clean out your kitchen cabinets, and you can give the unused items to your local food pantry. We all have things in our shelves that we're probably not going to eat, and this is a good opportunity. You can host a food drive. You can ask your friends and neighbors to help you collect food for your local food pantry. Now, here is how you do it. You collect a bunch of empty paper bags, and you print a little thing out, and you make copies, a little notice, which says this is a food drive for whatever food pantry, and I'm dropping this bag off here today, and I will pick this bag up on such and such date. And if you can leave some food in this bag, I will take it to the food pantry. So that is, then you drop these bags off in your neighborhood, and then you go back on the appointed day and you pick up the bags. And for the most part, the people do it, and they're very happy to do it. So it's a fun thing to do. And you can donate clean egg cartons and reusable shopping bags to your food pantry. The plastic bags that you get at the grocery store that we're all wondering what to do with and we don't feel comfortable using, you can take them to your food pantry and they will be used and reused and reused and reused. I had several people who brought bags. They were really needed because we didn't have any money for bags, and if you didn't have bags and we didn't have bags, then you went home with food that was in your arms. And so the egg cartons are really helpful because I don't know what it is now. It's been a couple of years since I've ordered eggs from the food bank. But when I ordered eggs from the food bank, I got them in cases of like about 13 dozen eggs. And so they were just loose eggs. They were in these flat trays, but they were definitely not cartons of eggs. So if we could have some cartons, some egg cartons, that would be really nice. And if you have a garden, how many of you have planted a garden this year and you feel like you've got a lot more ripe produce than you thought you were going to have? Well, take it to the food pantry. And you can clean out your closet. You can take your gently used clothing and your gently used bedding to a pantry. And if you don't want to take it to a pantry, you can take it to a soup kitchen. I know that over in Kingston, there's a People's Place as a combination food pantry and used clothing place that's very reasonably priced. You can also take it to Family. Family has a lot of, they have a shop there as well. And you can celebrate your birthday. You can invite people to your birthday party and ask them to give donations to a food pantry instead of a gift. And you can set up a pantry. You can set up a pantry in a church or a synagogue or a school. Schools need food pantries. Colleges need food pantries. Daycare centers need food pantries. All of these places need food pantries. You can give a little throughout the year by regularly donating to a food pantry. So the first thing I say is donate food to a food pantry. You can either take them food every week or every month, or you can take them every quarterly, or if hauling food over the pantry becomes difficult, you can send a check, or you can send them a gas card every month or every quarter. And you can contact elected officials and persons of influence and motivate them to make ending hunger and homelessness a priority. Encourage them to support fair wages and benefits for workers. Now this I will say, we've all just gone through this runoff, this primary election, and we had all these people coming through and knocking on our doors. And I listened to all of these people who said, I'm for this, and I'm for this, and I'm for this. Nobody was even, it wasn't even on the radar screen. And we have fewer and fewer dollars for hungry people. And nobody that was running for office even knew, it was just, You can read a book. You can read this book. You can read I Don't Hang Out in Churches Anymore. You can read Take This Bread by Sarah Miles. You can read Under the Overpass by Mike Yankowski. You can read I Am Your Neighbor by David Brown and Roger Wright. Those are the 3 books about food pantries that are out there. And actually, Mike Yankowski's is not about a food pantry. It's about hunger and homelessness. And you can start a school backpack program. This is a good time to do this. And what you do is you get a group of people together and you put certain kinds of food in backpacks and you take them over to the school on Friday. And then when the children go home on Friday afternoon, the little children who will not have any food to eat over the weekend have a backpack to take home with them. And you can volunteer. I was just reading the other day that People's Place needs volunteers. And Clinton Avenue Methodist Church, although was not on that list, probably needs volunteers as well. And you can share your action guide. The action guide in this book, the action guide that comes with this book, because it's a page marker, you can share. You can also share the book, read the book and then share it. You can read the book and take it to a library. You can read a book and give it to a friend. And remember that your kind thoughts, support, and prayers are always appreciated. Pantries cannot succeed without the backing of the communities where they exist. Your help is necessary to fight hunger in America. And of course, fighting hunger in America is not something that we really do. All we do is try to work so that people are not hungry. And this book has some pictures. It's an interesting book. It has a couple of 3 pictures of the inside of the pantry. It has some pictures of pantry shelves, and it's a very, very local book. This is a book that you may find a person's name here. You may find someone that you know in this book. And it's a book that also talks about where the food comes from, because that's what everybody wants to know. They all want to know, where does the food come from? And of course, the food comes from all kinds of places. It comes from farms, it comes from restaurants, it comes from food manufacturers, it comes from food drives. And this is one of the things, as I say this, a lot of people get very generous toward food pantries and soup kitchens in November and December. Please, please remember, there are 10 other months in the year, and the summer months are brutal. They are so brutal because people are not thinking about the hunger. The people who have food and can go on a vacation are thinking about that vacation. They are not thinking about those among us who do not have food. And so pantries they really have it tough. And also, it's really important to understand that when pantries get food from a food bank, it's not like a grocery store getting food from the wholesaler, because everything that comes into a food pantry is donated. Everything that comes into a food pantry is given. So that if nobody donates any peanut butter, you don't get any peanut butter. It's just not there. If nobody donates any olive oil or any cooking oil, there is no cooking oil. If nobody donates any flour, there is no flour. And traditionally, salt, pepper, flour, mayonnaise, mustard, cooking oils, these things were just not available. After I got into it, and after the numbers began to escalate, and I went to these training classes, I learned things about getting food, and I learned how to make substitutions. For example, most of the time, we could get some kind of a pasta. We could have macaroni or pasta, spaghetti, whatever. We could have packages of that. But we went through some real dry spells with tomato sauce. And it would have been a really nice thing if somebody could have come home from work and you have in your kitchen a package of pasta and a package of tomato sauce. You can put the two together in a crock pot or an electric skillet or a popcorn popper or whatever, and have a meal, have a one-dish meal. That just wasn't happening. And I was trying everywhere to get tomato sauce and trying everywhere to get any kind of pasta sauce. And finally, at one point, one food company came out with 4 cooking sauces. Progresso came out. They engineered 4 different cooking sauces. and they were different flavors. And one of those sauces was red. It was called a fire something or other. And I realized then that that could probably, in most cases, substitute for pasta. And I was so excited that we were going to have, for a while anyway, some pasta sauces. And another thing that we often did without was soup. It was really hard to get soup. Sometimes of the year it was available, and sometimes of the year it wasn't, and you couldn't tell when. Because everything was based on donations. And we didn't have a wholesaler that I could call up and say, hey, we didn't get very many donations this week. Can you send me 15 cases of this or 2 cases of that? No, because the wholesaler was the food bank, and the food bank was living off the donations itself. So it was really, really, hard. And coffee, forget it. Coffee is not in a food pantry. There were some teas and we were able often to give a person 1 tea bag for every person in the household, or 2 tea bags for every person in the household. But very rarely did somebody get a whole box of tea. That did not happen because nobody donated it. And very rarely did we get a can of coffee because it just was not offered. Butter was not there. Margarine was not there. As the years went by, the food bank really encouraged us through the Hunger Prevention Nutrition Assistance Program to have freezers. And I managed to get 4 freezers right in the beginning. And this was at a time when food pantries didn't have freezers. Food pantries didn't have freezers. Food pantries didn't have money for freezers. Food pantries didn't have the food that would go in freezers, on and on and on. I managed to get people to donate 4 freezers. And we put them in the barn back behind the church. And it was in a building that was owned by the Woodstock B&B on the Green. And that was a real lifesaver. That was a true lifesaver. And that barn did have electricity. The man was very generous. They never charged me. I was willing to pay, but they never charged me. It was a dirt floor. I covered the dirt floor with folded down, broken down cardboard boxes. And then we piled pallets on top. And I can remember that I had everything on 2 pallets. And then when I knew that Hurricane Irene was coming, I went and scrounged some more pallets, and I by myself went into that barn and opened the door, and I stacked up another pallet so that the refrigerators and the freezers were on a stack of 3 pallets, which was really a necessary thing. And then, of course, after Hurricane Irene and after Superstorm Sandy, both, after though we had such influxes of people because they were in such a need. And we had it good in Woodstock because during Superstorm Sandy and after Hurricane Irene, if you went out 28, Boyceville was really suffering down there. Towns were really suffering. Margaretville had a terrible time, and Woodstock was kept safe. So we can be grateful for that. I know that there are a lot of local names in this story because it's a local story, but it doesn't have to be a local story because this story it's a critical story and it's universal. It's for everyone. This story is about everyone, and none of us. This is probably, if I learned nothing but this is what I learned from this food pantry experience. We are all one terrible event away from being homeless and hungry. And it does not take a Superstorm Sandy. It does not take a Hurricane Irene. It can take a disease. Healthcare is in a critical balance right now. And we have had our politicians now bragging that they're just letting the healthcare die in this country. And all it takes is one good disease to rob you of everything you have. Because anymore, these hospitals are they're not that generous. And I don't know what is going to happen to those among us who are not American citizens. I don't know. They get sick too. Their children get sick. Their children go to school. I don't know what's going to happen. I do not understand that. I have a chapter that I would like to read. It may be too long. One of the things that did happen in this pantry is there was a bias against people with automobiles. And what nobody really realized about automobiles is that when it comes to a food pantry, the automobile is the last vestige of the past. By the time a person drives up to the food pantry, many times they've lost their job, they have lost their house, they have lost their family, they have lost all of their furniture, they have lost everything that they own, and the only thing that they still have is their car. And quite often, they're living in the car. People don't understand that. They see this car and they say, well, if this person can afford this, then they should be able to afford food. And they do not understand. They also do not understand that there are areas in New York State, and this is true all over the country, where you're out in the sticks, and if you don't have a car, you are going to starve to death because you don't have a grocery store. You cannot get to a grocery store unless you can really hike some miles. And you just need that car. It's just a very, very important thing. My heart goes out to the people who live in this area, who are in the countryside, who are miles from a community, even if it's only 5 miles or 2 miles. There is no grocery store in that community. They live in what we call a food desert. And if they're old and they can't drive anymore, how are they going to get food? Those are the least among us, the elderly, who just simply do not have the food. The other question that so many people have is they say, well, how can these people need food? How can they come to a food pantry? Look at that expensive phone they've got. Well, of course they have that phone. They have no choice. That is their connection to the outside world. If you don't have that phone, you can have a phone and not have a computer. If you don't have that phone, how are you going to get a lead on a job? How are you going to find a place to live? How are you going to get an appointment with anybody? How are you going to communicate with the outside world? This is the important thing about the computer. So I have a short chapter. I just looked. I think we'll have time for it. And it's entitled Amy. During the years after 2007, when hunger rose weekly in food pantries throughout our country, libraries opened their bathrooms, books, computers, doors, and their heated or air-conditioned buildings during cold, wet, hot weather to those whose resources were suddenly restricted, diminished, gone. Amy Raff was the Woodstock Public Library Director in Woodstock, New York. Throughout this challenging period, Amy saw to it that the Woodstock Public Library was a haven for the cold, homeless, hungry, tired. This included their pets when they brought them in on a leash. Whenever I visited the library, I saw the space filled with people avoiding inclement weather, reading newspapers, using library computers. Woodstock is a wonderful place, but public bathrooms are few unless there's money for a meal in a cafe. The restroom in the library was popular, to say the least. Computers are crucial to the homeless, the struggling poor, the underemployed, and the unemployed. Without a computer or an expensive cell phone, it's almost possible to find a food pantry, get a job, learn about a bus route, locate a shelter, or make an appointment of any kind. The library is a lifeline for people, artists, crazies, disabled, elderly, employed, homeless, ill, messed up, musicians, resource poor, situational poor, struggling poor, transients, veterans, working poor, and writers. In the Woodstock Public Library, as in any library, the librarian is the hub, and Amy was a special gift to our community during this time. She knew how to treat people, whether homeless or billionaires. She offered dignity, honor, respect, and smiles. And I have, one of the things that we have is we have a lot of different people who come to a food pantry. The food pantry, when you come to a food pantry, nobody asks you, all we asked was, what is your name, and how many people in your household, and how many of them are seniors, how many of them are adults, and how many of them are children. And we didn't go beyond that. Because food pantries, you live in this country, you're getting food that is diverted from a landfill, and that's just the way it is. We don't say, well, you're not old enough, you're too old, you're too sick, you're not sick enough, you have too many people in your household, you don't have enough people. It doesn't matter. If a person is hungry and they need food, they have access to a food pantry. And you can be needing a food pantry and still get food stamps. I have often said that when people get their Medicare card, they should also get a list of all the neighborhood food pantries, and they should get an address of how to get their SNAP card, and they should get their first SNAP card. SNAP cards are very, very important. This is the modern day version of food stamps, and this is part of our life now. People need food stamps. Food for many people has become a luxury. I hope you have found this an interesting hour, an interesting time to write about, to learn about hunger. I hope you find time to get a book. You can go to the website, thurmangreco.com, and order it through PayPal. I am at Mowers Meadow occasionally, trying to be there most Saturdays, although there are a lot of Saturdays and Sundays when I cannot make it. And I am also occasionally giving talks at libraries. And I am also giving classes once a month at the St. Gregory's Episcopal Church with, all the funds going to the Woodstock Dog Park. The Woodstock Dog Park Committee maintains the Woodstock Dog Park, and we do so through the generosity of our backs and our hearts, because no one gives us any money and no one pays us to do the job. So whatever needs to be done, if we need new fencing, for example, we've got to come up with the money for the fencing. And always, late in the season, we have these storms that are really tough on the fencing, and tough on the trees. And you know, when a tree goes down in the dog park, it costs a lot of money to get it taken care of, even with the discount from limber trees. So I'm going to be there once a month, and my books are available there as well. But if you'd like to get it right away, go to thurmangreco.com and order it from PayPal, and it will be delivered to you in the mail. And I thank you very, very much for having the patience to sit through this program, and I look forward to seeing you when you are interested in getting a copy of the book.